The journey ends where it began, in the cold and beautiful reflection of the final chrome horizon we all share. Stay with us for the ultimate resolution of our cinematic arc and the reveal of the truth. Hit subscribe now and witness the most important ending today.
The paper on my desk had a crack running through the handle. I'd noticed it on my first week and never replaced it. 7 years later, it was still there, still working, held together by habit and inertia, which I'd come to realize was also how that entire company operated. My name is Fiona. I was 38 years old, a senior HR compliance analyst at a mid-sized healthcare staffing firm in Columbus, Ohio. We placed nurses, PAs, and medical support staff at hospitals across the Midwest. On paper, we were a respectable operation, 240 employees, regional contracts with 3 hospital networks, a framed mission statement in the lobby about putting people first. That mission statement, I walked past it every single morning for 7 years. I want to tell you what happened. Not the cleaned up version, not the version where I knew exactly what I was doing every step of the way. The real version, where I was scared and second-guessing myself and eating peanut butter crackers at 11 at night staring at spreadsheets I wasn't sure I was reading correctly. It started with a file that wasn't supposed to exist. Late October, a Tuesday, I was pulling archived onboarding records for a routine state audit. Ohio Department of Health, nothing dramatic, they did it every 2 years. Our company was required to verify that every clinical staff member we placed had current licensure, background checks, and completed the mandatory abuse prevention training before their first shift. The audit window covered the previous 18 months. I had a list of 216 placements to verify. I was maybe 60 records in when I found her. I'll call her placement 61. She was a licensed practical nurse, placed at a long-term care facility outside Dayton. Her background check in our system showed a clearance date of March 14th. Her first placement date showed March 9th, 5 days before her background check cleared. I stared at that for a while, assumed it was a data entry error, flagged it, kept going. By the time I was at record 90, I had 11 of them. 11 placements where clinical staff had been sent to facilities before their background checks came back, not 1 or 2 days. Some of them were gaps of 2 weeks, 3 weeks. One was 31 days. I closed my laptop and sat in the break room for 10 minutes doing nothing. Here's what most people don't understand about healthcare staffing. Those background checks aren't bureaucratic red tape. They exist because you are placing strangers into rooms with elderly patients, with people in recovery, with children in pediatric units. A clearance isn't a formality. It is the minimum, and we had been skipping it. I went back to my desk and kept going through the list. By the end of that week, I had 44 records with the same pattern, 44 people placed before clearance. Of those, 9 had placements at facilities that serve vulnerable adult populations. 3 had placements that overlapped, meaning they were working shifts while their background check was still pending, and then a new placement started before the first one even formally closed. I built a summary document. 4 pages, dates, names, placement IDs, facility names, gap calculations in days, clear, organized. Every number pulled directly from our own internal database. Then I printed 2 copies, put them in a folder, and walked upstairs to my boss's office. His name was Derek, Director of Compliance and HR Operations. He'd been with the company 11 years, longer than me. He was the kind of manager who kept a bowl of candy on his desk and laughed easily and never seemed to be in a bad mood, which I had always taken as a sign of good character. I understand now that I was confusing pleasantness with integrity. I sat across from him and walked him through the document, showed him the timeline gaps, explained what the Ohio Administrative Code required, told him I thought we needed to pull the records, do a full audit, and self-report to the state before they found it themselves, because if they found it first, the penalties would be significantly worse. He listened, nodded in the right places, asked me 2 questions that seemed engaged and reasonable. Then he thanked me, took one of the copies of my document, and told me he'd look into it. I went back to my desk feeling like I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do. That was the last time Derek and I had a real conversation. 3 weeks passed. Nothing happened. I sent him a follow-up email asking about next steps. He replied that he was still reviewing the situation with leadership. I sent another email 2 weeks after that. Same answer, different words. In early December, I was called into a meeting I hadn't been told about in advance. Derek was there. So was the VP of HR, a woman named Sylvia, who I had spoken to maybe 4 times in 7 years. And sitting at the head of the conference table was a man I recognized from the company all-hands meetings, but had never spoken to personally, the COO. He joined the company about 2 years before, brought in from a private equity background to scale operations. He had the kind of stillness that powerful people sometimes have. Like everything around him was moving slightly too fast and he had decided not to participate. Sylvia did most of the talking. She said that my concerns had been reviewed and that the discrepancies I'd identified were the result of a system migration issue during our software transition in Q1 of that year. She said the dates I was looking at weren't reflecting actual clearance timelines, but rather a data sync delay. She said IT had already confirmed this. I asked if I could see that confirmation in writing. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long. Derek said he'd send it over. The COO had not said a single word during the meeting. As I was gathering my things to leave, he looked up from his phone and said, without any particular expression, "Fiona, we appreciate your diligence. That kind of attention to detail is exactly what we need in this role." I said thank you. I left. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. My neighbor was putting up Christmas lights. One strand was blinking unevenly. I watched it blink. I never received anything from Derek in writing. January came. I requested the IT confirmation again, formally, in an email with a read receipt. Derek read it. Did not respond. I went into our system and pulled the records again. They hadn't been corrected. The 44 placements were still showing the same gaps. If there had been a sync error, it would have been fixed. Then I found something else. While I was cross-referencing the original records, I noticed that 3 of the problematic placements had been edited after I'd first flagged them. Not corrected, edited. The background check dates had been changed in the system. 2 of them now showed clearance dates that predated the placement dates, making them look compliant. But I had printed the original records in October. I had the originals in my desk drawer. Someone had gone into the system and changed the dates to hide what I had found. I don't know what that felt like exactly. Shock isn't quite right. It was more like the floor becoming slightly less solid. Like the ground had always had given it and I was only now feeling it. I made copies of everything. The October printouts, the current system records showing the altered dates, a side-by-side comparison document. I put the originals in a folder. I took photographs of the documents with my personal phone. I emailed myself the scanned copies from a personal email account, not my work account. I want to be honest about my headspace during this period. I was not some fearless whistleblower operating with a clear plan. I was a 38-year-old woman who had worked at the same company for 7 years and was increasingly terrified that the only options available to me were to either pretend I hadn't seen any of this or blow up my entire career. I was thinking about my mortgage. I was thinking about the fact that I was single and my health insurance was through this job. I was thinking about my mother, who I helped support financially, and who didn't need to hear that her daughter had gotten herself fired for being a problem. I thought about letting it go. I need to be honest about that. I thought about it for real. But every time I opened that spreadsheet and looked at placement 61, I thought about a real person in a real facility in Dayton, and the people in that building who had no idea that the person caring for them hadn't been cleared yet. That wasn't abstract. That was a Tuesday morning in a room I'd never see, with someone who didn't know my name and would never know I existed. I couldn't let it go. In February, I filed a report with the Ohio Department of Health's Healthcare Quality Assurance Division. I used the formal whistleblower complaint process. I submitted my original October documentation, the side-by-side showing the altered records, and a written statement of what I had reported internally and what response I had received. I did not tell anyone at work that I had done this. I want to describe those next 6 weeks accurately because they were genuinely miserable. I went to work every day and sat at my desk and did my job and smiled at people in the hallway and felt like I was carrying something radioactive in my chest. Every time Derek walked past my desk, I wondered if he knew. Every meeting invitation I received, I spent the 10 minutes before it wondering if that was going to be the one where they called me in. I lost sleep. I made bad decisions at the grocery store. I started 3 different journaling practices and abandoned all of them. In mid-March, Derek called me into his office for what he said was a routine check-in. He asked about my current projects. He asked how I was feeling about my workload. Then he said, very casually, that there had been some concerns from leadership about whether my role was still the right fit given the company's direction. He said this was not a performance issue, just a strategic alignment question. He asked me to take some time to think about where I saw myself. I said I saw myself continuing to do the job I had been doing. He smiled and said he appreciated that. I left his office and walked straight to the bathroom and stood at the sink with the water running for about 90 seconds because I needed something to focus on. They were going to push me out. I could feel it being engineered in real time. The vague language, the non-accusation accusations, the framing of my 7-year tenure as a question of fit. I had seen it done to other people. I knew the playbook. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Derek and Sylvia. They told me my position was being restructured. They offered me a severance package, 8 weeks of pay, continuation of benefits through the end of the month. 8 weeks. For 7 years. I asked for the restructuring documentation. Sylvia said HR would provide it. I asked when. She said within 5 business days. I signed nothing. Here's where I need to tell you about something I had done 3 weeks earlier when I saw Derek's strategic alignment conversation for what it was. I had found a legal aid organization in Columbus that specialized in employment and whistleblower cases. I met with an attorney named, I'll just say, a woman, late 40s, very calm, the kind of calm that comes from having seen a lot of situations people thought were unprecedented. She reviewed my documentation. She asked me several questions about the timeline and what I had submitted to the state. She told me that Ohio's whistleblower protection statute likely applied to my situation, and that if my termination followed my protected disclosure by a traceable timeline, that was potentially actionable. She also told me to document everything from that point forward in writing. Every conversation, every meeting, every email. I had been doing that anyway. The day after the restructuring meeting, I received an email from the Ohio Department of Health. My case had been assigned to an investigator. They were requesting records from the company. The investigation was formally open. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a CVS and read that email 4 times. I had already turned in my badge. I had already cleaned out my desk, a small box, 7 years, mostly notebooks, and a plant that didn't survive the car ride home. I was technically no longer an employee, but the investigation was open. The next 3 months were not triumphant. I want to be clear about that because these stories sometimes skip from I filed the complaint to justice was served and make it sound like a clean arc. It wasn't. I filed for unemployment. The company contested it, claiming my separation was voluntary. I had to appeal. The appeal took 6 weeks. I won, eventually. But 6 weeks with no income when you have a mortgage is not a theoretical problem. I took a part-time contract position through a former colleague, doing benefits compliance work for a small medical practice. The pay was less than half my previous salary. I worked from home in the 2nd bedroom, I turned into an office, and I ate a lot of soup, and I watched a lot of bad television, and I called my mother twice a week and told her everything was fine. It was not fine, but it was survivable. My attorney kept me updated on the state investigation as she received information. The company had been required to produce records. Then they had been required to produce more records. Then an investigator had conducted site interviews. In June, the Ohio Department of Health issued its preliminary findings. The investigation confirmed placement of clinical staff prior to background check clearance in 38 documented cases. They also found evidence of retroactive record alteration, which elevated the matter beyond a compliance violation into potential falsification of state-regulated records. That finding triggered a referral to the Ohio Attorney General's office. My attorney called me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. I had to put my hand on the counter. The AG referral meant potential criminal exposure. It also meant that my whistleblower complaint was now formally part of a state enforcement action, which significantly strengthened my wrongful termination case. I asked her what happened next. She said we filed a wrongful termination lawsuit in Franklin County Common Pleas Court in August. The complaint detailed the timeline, my internal report in October, the company's failure to investigate, the document alteration, my retaliatory termination in April, the fact that my separation came exactly 11 weeks after my formal state filing. The company's outside counsel responded with a motion to dismiss that was, by my attorney's assessment, aggressive but not particularly novel. It was denied in October. Discovery started in November. I won't walk you through all of it. What I will tell you is that during the discovery process, emails were produced that my attorney described with characteristic understatement as helpful. Internal emails between Derek and the COO, dating back to November, 1 month after I first reported to Derek internally, in which the COO wrote, "The compliance flag from the HR analyst needs to be managed carefully. I'd rather contain this than escalate it." Managed. Contained. The deposition of the COO took place in January. I was not present for it, but my attorney was. She called me afterward. She said it was, in her words, instructive. In March, 17 months after I'd first sat across from Derek with my 4-page summary document, the company offered to settle. The settlement terms are confidential, and I won't state the specific numbers. What I can tell you is that it was meaningful, enough to cover the income gap, the legal fees, and then some. Enough that when I called my mother to tell her, she cried, and so did I, which is not something either of us does easily. The Ohio AG's investigation resulted in the company entering into a consent agreement with the state, remediation requirements, a compliance monitor placed for 2 years, and a civil penalty of $420,000. 2 individuals were referred for potential professional sanctions, including the COO, who resigned from his position in February, before the consent agreement was even finalized. I want to tell you the part that doesn't fit neatly into the timeline. A few months after the settlement, I was at a conference, back in HR compliance work, which I'd returned to because it turns out it is the thing I am actually good at and still care about, even after everything. I was at a roundtable session on documentation practices and healthcare staffing. A woman about 10 years younger than me raised her hand and asked what you do when you find something wrong and you're not sure if you're right or if you're just going to blow up your job for nothing. I thought about the cracked stapler. I thought about the blinking Christmas lights in my neighbor's yard. I thought about Placement 61, whose name I never knew, who was real and had no idea. I told her, document everything before you say a word to anyone. Personal copies, personal email, personal device. Then find out what the reporting process is, not your manager, not HR, the actual regulatory body, and understand that it will probably be hard and slow and expensive and nobody will thank you for it in real time. Then I said, you'll know whether you can live with the alternative. She nodded. She wrote something down. I don't know what she decided, but she asked the question, which meant she already knew. The cracked stapler is on my desk at my new office. I brought it with me. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it still works. Maybe because some things hold together longer than they have any right to, and that's worth something. I've thought about Derek a lot since this ended. Not with bitterness, that surprised me. More with a kind of tired clarity. He was pleasant. He kept candy on his desk. He smiled at the right moments and said the right words and genuinely seemed to believe, I think, that being agreeable was the same thing as being good. It isn't. That's not a moral judgment. It's just a fact about how damage gets done in the world, not always by cruel people, but often by comfortable ones who decide that the cost of looking away is lower than the cost of acting. The COO knew exactly what he was doing. I don't have any illusions about that. Manage it carefully. Contain it. Those were his words. He made a calculation that I was a smaller problem than the compliance exposure, that I could be quietly moved out before anything escalated. He was wrong, but not because of bad luck. He was wrong because the decision to falsify those records created a paper trail that couldn't be walked back. When you alter documents to cover a mistake, you don't erase the mistake. You add a second, worse one on top of it. That's not poetic justice. That's just how evidence works. What I keep coming back to is the question that women asked me at the conference. What do you do when you find something and you're not sure if it's worth blowing up your career over? And I keep thinking that she was asking the wrong question. Not because she was wrong to be scared, but because the framing was off. It wasn't my career on one side of the scale. It was 44 placements of uncleared clinical staff in facilities with vulnerable patients. Once I understood that clearly, the scale wasn't close. Clarity is a kind of courage. Not the dramatic kind, not standing up in a room and making a speech, the quieter kind, the kind that happens alone, in a car in a driveway, watching your neighbor's Christmas lights blink, where you look at what you actually know and decide you are not going to pretend otherwise. That's the whole thing, really. Most of the hard choices in life don't require bravery in the cinematic sense. They require honesty with yourself, in private, with no audience, when walking away would be completely understandable. I was scared for most of it. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like mine sometimes get told in a way that flattens the fear out, makes it sound like the person always knew they were right, always had a plan, always kept it together. I didn't. I ate a lot of bad food and slept poorly and called my mother and said everything was fine when it wasn't. Being scared and continuing anyway isn't the absence of fear. It's just what integrity actually looks like from the inside, in real time, before you know how it ends. The cracked stapler is still on my desk. I don't know exactly why I kept it. Maybe because it's a reminder that the things that hold together aren't always the things that look whole. 7 years of evidence, 4 pages of documentation, 1 personal email account with scanned copies sent at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Sometimes the difference between accountability and erasure is just whether someone decided to keep a paper copy. Derek made his choice. The COO made his. I made mine. Those choices didn't exist in separate universes. They were in the same one and they collided, and the result was proportional to what each person was actually willing to do. I don't think that's cosmic. I think that's just how systems work when someone refuses to let the record disappear.